How we doing, nation? John here. Thank you for being here first and foremost. This channel is really growing on me. I love Prepper Nation. I love to talk about preparedness, but at the same time, I love to talk about history. I think these are two subjects that people are really not talking about enough. You know, most people look at preppers and they're like, you know, lunatics or whatever, and they go about their daily lives, and then they get hit with SHTF. When it comes to history, just there are not enough people interested in it, not enough people really studying history. So the fact that you're here and that you're interested in history, guys, we're historians at this point. So this is going to be very interesting. When's the last time you listened to any kind of history podcast and the guy that was flapping his jaws was wearing a camo shirt, a blazer, cheap blazer at that, and an NBA hat, which will probably be coming off at some point during this podcast. Okay, so we're talking about the top 5 generals of all time. And this is almost impossible to do because there have been so many throughout history, especially getting back to the ancient period, you know, back during the Roman Empire and even before that, because a lot of stuff was not documented very well, or it's been lost throughout, you know, the transition of generations. And so I've had to base my list off of the stuff that's available. You know what I mean? There could definitely be better generals out there that lived a long, long time ago. I'm actually going to throw 4 more on here that are honorable mentions. But before I do, I need to explain why 2 names are completely off this list, okay? You guys, if you're into history, you're going to recognize these 2 names. And I'm going to explain my reasoning for leaving them off the list. Now, here's the thing. When you talk to a historian, you talk to 100 historians, and you ask them, who are the top 5 generals of all time? You're going to get 100 different answers because we look at things differently. Some people look at aggressiveness as a good thing in battle, some not so much. It's just there's so many tactics involved. The numbers are different on both sides. The battles, the magnitude of the battles. So I'm not claiming, let me just say this right now, nation. I'm not claiming this is the end-all be-all list. Like this is the official top 5 throughout history. This is my top 5. Okay, and you guys are going to disagree with some of the names on the list, I'm sure, and that's okay. But please leave your top 5 in the comments, if you don't mind, please. So the 2 names that have been left off of this list. Number 1, George Washington. I realize he was the first president of the United States. I realize he was the general back during 1776 and, you know, won the Revolutionary War. However, my reasoning for leaving him off the list is very simple. He had a much larger force than Cornwallis. Okay, not straight Patriots versus Redcoats, but Washington had a lot of other things going in his favor. So first of all, the Native Americans were here. The Native Americans had taught Patriots how to fight in a different manner that Cornwallis had really never seen before. They considered the Native Americans, the Indians, to be savages. And so they really did not fight the same way whatsoever. Number 2, the colonies were getting a lot of aid from France. France was still at this point in time a huge rival of England. And so they were also trying to stick it to England to kind of drop them down as world leader. And then number 3, I would say the terrain. Not only the terrain, were the Patriots familiar with the country and the Redcoats not so much, but also you have to think, okay, when Cornwallis gets here, and he gets here with the British troops, okay, they have a basic idea of where certain towns are at in certain cities, small cities, but they have no idea at this point where the Patriots are holed up. They have no idea who really is leading the Patriots outside of Washington. They don't have any intel whatsoever. So Cornwallis was really tasked with a huge disadvantage out of the gates, and he nearly won the war anyway. If it would not have been for the militias, I would argue that he would have won the war early on. So that is why George Washington is not on this list. And also, Washington did not have tons of military experience, and he had not won a whole lot outside of the Revolutionary War. Of course, he becomes president, and that's that. The second name you're not going to see on this list, and this is probably going to trigger some people, Ulysses S. Grant. I did not put Ulysses S. Grant on here for many of the same reasons. He started the Civil War with a huge advantage in terms of, armament, numbers. He had tons of soldiers. I mean, he had everything basically playing to his favor, and should have ended, we'll talk about this later, but he should have ended the war in 3 months, statistically speaking. But in my opinion, he wasn't a good enough general to get Robert E. Lee down that quickly. So honorable mentions. All right, Frederick the Great, okay, from Prussia. Dude is a legend over there. I think, if I'm not mistaken, he only had 9 or 10 battles, major battles or conflicts to his resume. That being said, he won them handedly. Just a great with tactics. Hannibal Barca. You can go back and Google this cat. I mean, he was bad to the bone. He was really one of the first generals that kind of organized things and started dictating rank and stuff like that, So, I mean, a lot of credit is deserved there, in my opinion. Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan was a madman, but he was an incredible leader, an incredible soldier, and he held much of the world for a very long time. And finally, a name that you probably never heard of before, unless you are extremely into history, and that is Matthew Ridgway. He was a general during the Korean War. When the United States was getting its tail kicked and we almost got run out of South Korea by the Chinese, Ridgway came in, he replaced the standing general, he changed the tactics up. And he is the one basically that defeated, we didn't defeat the Chinese. I would call it a stalemate in Korea, but he defeated their strategy. And he really started to push them back towards the North Korean border. Otherwise, there would be one Korea right now. It would be North Korea. But because of Matthew Ridgway and his strategy, there are 2 Koreas. And at least half of it is not communist, right? So let's get into the top 5. I'm interested to see who you guys pick for top 5, by the way. Number 5. Again, controversial pick. There are going to be 2 names on this list, maybe 3, that are going to blow people away. A couple of them are on every major list that I've ever seen historians write. But 3 of them, I'm reaching on 3 of these, okay? So number 5, Lord Charles Cornwallis. I know this is a reach. This was, again, the British commander during the Revolutionary War. But this man basically wrote the battlefield tactics that had been used for 100 years. I mean, he developed all of the strategies. They were still using this guy's battlefield tactics 100 years after the Revolutionary War. I mean, he looked at battle like a chess game, and he was extremely good at it. Again, he was defeated by Washington and by the Bluecoats, but they had a bunch of help, right? The militia stepped in. The militia really saved George Washington early on. They allowed Washington to escape, and I believe, oh my God, I believe Washington got away. I say Washington. And I think he went to Winchester, Virginia, if I'm not mistaken. And he took some months in Winchester, and he basically reformed the army, what was left of the army, and redid his strategy. And there were tons of battles up in that area. But Cornwallis, again, was tasked with almost the unwinnable. You land on enemy soil that you're not familiar with. You have no idea where the enemies are holed up. You don't know where the major military bases are at. You don't know where the arms are at, the firearms. You don't know where the black powder's at. You don't know where the reserves and the regular soldiers are even at. You don't know where the militia's at. You have no idea. See, in war, you want to attack things like resources. You want to hit. We just saw this a couple of weeks ago, a week and a half ago, guys. The U.S. hit Syria, airstruck them. The reason they airstruck them is they were hitting resources. They were trying to take a lot of weapons out of the field of play, if you will, just to smack them on the hand and warn them. It was a saber rattle, basically. Cornwallis couldn't do this because he had no idea. He had no idea where any of this stuff was at. On top of this, he gets extra credit because he voted against the Stamp Act. He was actually pro a colonist. On a personal level, Cornwallis thought the colonists were getting treated unfairly. He looked at the colonists as English, right? He looked at these people as his countrymen. He didn't look at this as a sovereign nation. So he is trying to fight a war with zero intel, right? And he's using kid gloves because he doesn't want to mistreat these people. And he's fighting against an enemy that has learned how to fight like a savage. In his words, these people are fighting like Native Americans. They're hitting and running guerrilla warfare, basically. And he was just, he couldn't believe it. He's like, my countrymen are hiding in the woods behind trees and ambushing us. Never seen anything like it. So he had to kind of learn on the fly. This is how things are being done. He had to gather intel. Now, Washington and the colonies, they pretty much knew what Cornwallis had brought with him because they had to actually land in the colonies. And so spies would run back and tell them, they got this, son, they got this, this how many soldiers they got. But, man, that's tight on my head. Cornwallis was at a serious disadvantage. And also, after the Revolutionary War, he wasn't actually demoted. England still realized this dude is a straight up boss when it comes to, running a battlefield. There's no way they were just going to release him or whatever. So they sent him to Prussia. They sent him to Prussia to meet with, who were we just talking about? Frederick the Great, Legend of Prussia. And so he watches some of the drills that Frederick the Great has put together. And he later writes, Cornwallis later writes, basically, this dude's an idiot. He has no idea what he's doing in terms of battlefield tactics. That's how far ahead he was of even Frederick the Great. So he is my number 5. Now, number 4, I'm going to try my best not to bang this guy's name up. I'm probably going to do it. I'm telling you straight up. I wrote this one down. All right, here we go. Admiral Yamamoto. And for those of you that do not know, this was during World War II, he was the admiral of the Japanese fleet. And he is the one that masterminded the attack on Pearl Harbor. Okay, so Pearl Harbor could possibly be the greatest strike in military history. The greatest single strike in military history. And here's why. This, again, just my opinion. So the Japanese did not want to strike Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto went to the emperor and he basically said, look, we need to take out the fleet. We need to take out the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. All of the advisors to the emperor are like, no, this is a horrible idea. It only has a 50-50 chance of actually being successful. And Yamamoto was smart enough to understand that the Japanese, how can I put this? They're very big on honor. They will fight to the death for honor. We saw a lot of that during World War II. They would just come in kamikaze style and hit battleships and gladly die for the honor of the Empire of Japan. So honor was a huge deal with them, okay? And he understood by, pitching it a certain way to the emperor is not going to listen to his advisors. He's going to listen to me. And so he basically played to honor. He said, look, there's probably only a 50-50 chance that we will be successful. And the advisors are telling you no because there's only a 50-50 chance. And he told the emperor, look, if we're successful, we will gain more honor in one single battle than our nation has ever known. And the emperor at that point was on board. So Yamamoto takes a smaller Japanese fleet. I want you guys to think about the logistics here for a second. And he trucks them across the ocean. They are under radio silence. Okay, this is back when the radar was first a thing. So they had to avoid radar detection. Planes flying through the sky, okay, because again, the world's at war. So he has to take his entire fleet across the ocean, undetected, with complete radio silence, right? So they would basically blink spotlights back and forth at the ships, from ship to ship. And the smaller ships and things, they needed to refuel. So they had to do this as they were traveling across the ocean, trying not to get caught. The reason that Pearl Harbor was a success for the Japanese, at least, is because the Americans had no idea that they were there. No idea. And when it was first radioed in, to command at Pearl Harbor, they thought that it was a mistake. Somehow it's a mistake. There's no way an entire fleet gets across the ocean. There's just no way. Undetected. But Yamamoto did this with the Japanese. And he would have basically at this point taken the United States out of the war, except for some of the major battleships. 2 or 3 of the major battleships, I believe, were out of port at the time. So the United States still had some hardware out in the ocean. Otherwise, they would have been completely out in terms of the Navy. So it was a success for the Japanese. It's not what they were hoping for, but it certainly woke the United States up. So he is going to be number 4 on my list simply because he was a gambler. This caught up to him later at the Battle of Midway, if you guys are familiar with the Battle of Midway. This guy gambled all the time. 50-50 chance, he's like, and he rolled the dice every single time. And he eventually got caught. He got caught. His planes were being re-outfitted on the decks of his battleships, and the U.S. got him at the Battle of Midway. They tore him up after that. But the Battle of Pearl Harbor was a huge success for the Japanese. And, he got almost everything he wanted except for the few battleships. So moving on to number 3, this one is a no-brainer. Some historians will put him at number 2 or maybe even number 1. I put him at number 3, and that's Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar is one of the most successful, I got a hair in my eye or something here, one of the most successful military commanders of all time. But what makes Julius Caesar so important throughout history is he not only understood battlefield tactics, but he understood politics. He knew the people that he needed to talk to in the political scene. He knew people outside of the country, other leaders. He knew which ones he could trust. He knew how to play certain people against other people. And then on top of all of this, of course, he had a massive army at his back. Julius Caesar was not necessarily a gambler. He would go in heavy-handed. He would go in with a lot more troops most of the time than the defending nation. And, he was just a menacing figure. This guy had to defeat other generals in order to make himself emperor. At this point, I mean, he was never really officially emperor. He just had collected so many countries that he declared himself, I'm the emperor. What are you going to do about it, son? So Julius Caesar, I mean, he's number 3 on the list just because he had so much success, you know, throughout the course of his career, both politically and on the battlefield. He's not number 1 in my book because, again, he went in every single time heavy-handed. He never really had to gamble. He never, you know, he knew the right people to holler at if he needed help or whatever. But you can't discredit the fact that he's top 5. So number 2, very, very controversial pick here, guys. Who do I have pegged as the number 2 general of all time? Robert E. Lee. And here's why. Okay, Robert E. Lee kind of brought everything together. Some of your generals throughout history, they are going to be people that can stand up and motivate men. Okay, some can be menacing to soldiers. Soldiers want to, you know, soldiers want to break ranks and run, okay? And they see someone, they see a general like this, and it either motivates them to stay in, you know, they get that patriotism going, or they see this figure, and this figure's so much larger than life that they just feel like they feel compelled to stay. Robert E. Lee was all of this. You know, he was originally asked to lead the Union Army, and he's like, nah. Taking it back, the reason why he was, I should have mentioned this earlier, but the reason, for those that don't know, the Civil War basically went down Ulysses S. Grant versus Robert E. Lee. But Ulysses S. Grant was not the first pick for Lincoln and the U.S. military. They wanted Robert E. Lee. And the reason was, the U.S. prior had had a war with Mexico. And folks, the U.S. was getting beat handedly. And they had a couple of young officers, Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee. And Robert E. Lee was the one that figured the Mexican army out and put the smackdown on them, basically. He figured their tactics out. He was brilliant when it came to battlefield tactics. So America would look totally different if there was never a Robert E. Lee. People forget that. So anyway, fast forwarding to the Civil War, they present him with the job. We want you to be the general of the entire U.S. Army. And he's like, nah, not going to lead the Union into my own state of Virginia. Not going to ravage the state that I live in, you know. He basically told him, and I'm paraphrasing, he said, you know, I love the United States, but he was more, a lot of Confederate leaders, to be honest, were more centered around their home states than they were the Union anyway. And he was the same way. So was Stonewall Jackson. So Robert E. Lee had the benefit of really good generals. I mean, he had Beauregard, he had, again, Stonewall Jackson, but he was just masterful. He could look at a map and get the intel that he had. Not only could he put units where they needed to be, he was very much like Cornwallis in this sense, okay? I would argue that outside of Cornwallis, Robert E. Lee was the most brilliant battlefield technician that's ever lived, in my opinion. He could put units in certain places because he understood the terrain. He understood the high ground. He understood where the flanks were going to be. He understood all of this stuff. He also understood the spots where he could actually gamble. So in other words, what I mean by that is he knew on the battlefield, look, if we're stuck here, this is an area that I can gamble with, because he could think so far ahead that he knew, okay, Beauregard's going to have his unit over here. So if I gamble here, it's going to play to my favor. To put it in terms that everybody can understand, this guy was basically a card counter in Vegas. I mean, he knew what was going to happen, it seemed like, before it happened. When you take a look at the numbers of troops and you take a look at the numbers of supplies and weapons and how much food, etc., between the Confederate States of America and the Union Army. The Confederates should have been done in 3 months. I mean, it should not have went on for years and years. But the reason was Robert E. Lee was so good. He continued to, they would pin Robert E. Lee down, or they think they would have him pinned down, you know, and it would look like he was out of luck. But what was really going on is Robert E. Lee had positioned his people, you know, his soldiers in an area to make it look like he was out of luck. And he knew in the back of his mind, he was thinking so far ahead, he knew, I've got this general on the way. I don't have to defeat this, you know, this advancing army or, you know, whatever, regiment. All I have to do is hold them until backup gets here. And so he could think so far ahead. He's like that chess player that thinks 10 or 12 steps ahead, right? Or moves. So he's able to drag the war out far longer than it should have went. And, you know, because of this, he is my number 2. Now, he was very aggressive, and he was a bit of a gambler. It caught up to him at the end of the war. Basically, at the end of the war, he ran out of regiments to bail him out. He found himself with a bunch of soldiers that were starving to death, that were half clothed. They didn't have a lot of ammunition left. And then he was on the run, basically, at that point. And every so often, he would try to be, he would try to play to the strengths that he was used to. Like, he would become aggressive out of the blue, and it would cost him a bunch of soldiers. But he was really in a corner at that point. So, gambler definitely, and aggressive. Let me tell you about the number 1 general of all time. It's Napoleon, by the way. Spoiler alert. So this man, how do we explain Napoleon? Napoleon is recklessly aggressive. He took the aggression that we saw, like we were just talking with Robert E. Lee, to a whole new level. He was the kind of person that would march 500 troops against 5,000 troops. And he would gamble that these 5,000 troops would be so bewildered by the fact that he was charging that it actually evened the battle out. And usually it did. Don't know why, quite frankly, but it did. I mean, he inspired people. He could give a speech to those 500 men. He could get up on his horse and he could talk to them for a few minutes, and he could make them believe that they could beat the 5,000 men. The 5,000 men could have the high ground. You know, that you do not want to charge high ground from a military standpoint. But Napoleon would say, look, man, you know, this is only, you know, we could beat 10,000 people. This is nothing. And he would fire the guys up, and then they would go take the high ground. He did this time and time again. So Napoleon, getting to the revolution. Okay, this is right when the revolution is, you know, it's kind of on the offset. It's getting ready to happen. Napoleon is kind of a mid-ranking general at this time. You know, he's in there, but barely. And he wrote a lot about these parties. He would go to these parties, and all of the high-ranking military were there. All of the bureaucrats were there. And it was just like the big, I think he called it a gala or something. And he would go, and people knew who he was, but they didn't really pay any attention to him. You know what I mean? He's just like that random dude that shows up at a party. Nobody's talking to him. They might nod or whatever. So the revolution's getting ready to start. People are protesting, whatever they call it back in the day. I mean, they were just mad. They were getting ready to overthrow the government. And everybody knew what needed to happen in order to keep the government together, at least for a while. But nobody wanted to do it. You know what I mean? Nobody wanted to do it. All of the high-ranking generals are like, you know, trying to pass it off to somebody else. Because whoever does it's going to become, they think, demonized by the people. And so it eventually falls down to Napoleon. And Napoleon, you know, and I'm summarizing in only a way that I can, he basically says, hold my beer. And he goes down in the middle of the street. He takes 5 minutes. He gets the men to roll a cannon up there, and he fires a cannon at point blank range into a crowd of people, which is horrible, horrific. But at the same time, I mean, he's 10 feet away with a cannon, and he just blasts them. And 20 minutes later, nobody's protesting anymore. And now Napoleon's a hero. Now he begins, everybody knows who this cat is at the party. Everybody wants to talk to him. He becomes popular. And what they don't understand at the time is he's not demonized for it. A lot of people in France had been waiting for that to happen, waiting for somebody to have the stones to do it. And so he becomes basically a popular hero in his country. Begins moving up the ranks, wins a bunch of wars, wins a bunch of battles and things like this. They send him to the worst places possible that these other generals don't want to deal with. Napoleon's like, I'll be back in 6 months. And he comes back in 6 months and he's taking the country. He's just taken. France is really building up power at this point. Napoleon becomes the man. He becomes the man in charge, if you will, in France. And he leads for a while. The battlefield success is still there. But he gets, I guess, ousted would be the best way to say it. Coup d'etat, whatever you want to call it. And they say, okay, this cat right here, we're going to exile him. So exile means they're just sending him to an island where he's going to live out the rest of his life. They don't want him in the way anymore. He's too popular at this point. The bureaucrats can't do what the bureaucrats need to do. And they put him on an island. He's got some soldiers there to guard him until basically he dies. And it's a bad situation to be in, okay? So Napoleon gets to this island. He's not boo-hooing about it. He's not upset whatsoever. He sits down in the house that they've afforded him or whatever for exile, and he begins drawing up battle plans. And a year or so later, he just walks outside and he says, I'm getting on the boat today and I'm heading back to France. And these soldiers are like looking at each other, and he talks to them and he motivates them. He says, look, I'm going to take our country back. These corrupt bureaucrats are not going to take our country. I'm going to take it back. And he talks his way to these soldiers. He talks his way onto the boat. And they're basically like, look, once you get to the mainland, they're going to arrest you. They're going to try you for treason. They're going to hang you or shoot you or whatever. He's like, I'll take the chance. So he gets back to the mainland, gets to France. Dudes, they recognize him immediately. It's Napoleon. He's got his outfit on and his hat and everything. And dude just starts walking through town. First town he gets to. Soldiers come up and we have orders to arrest you. And he's like, you can arrest me, or you can come with me and we can take our country back. And so it's amazing. Like he motivates people as he goes along and builds an army. He just keeps absorbing soldiers more and more and more and more. And then when he finally gets, to where he's going, the word gets out to the king, and the king's like, we got to run. This dude's got a bigger army than we have. They keep sending soldiers out to arrest Napoleon. These people are like die hard for the king. They're 100% for the king. And the king's like, go arrest him, bring his head to me, whatever you got to do. And so they go. They're like, they've sworn the oath. They're like, we'll be back, in a few days. And they get there, and Napoleon convinces them, that's not the king, son. I'm the king. Come with me. Help me take our freaking country back. No more nonsense. And the king basically runs out of people to send. He almost has no soldiers at this point. He realizes, okay, when he gets here, I have nobody to fight him. So the king runs. He just takes off. He's going to exile himself at this point. Napoleon goes back. He takes over the country. Doesn't really have to fire a shot. He just takes it back over. He becomes a major figure again. The public, again, they love him. And he does this for a while. At this point, he begins to lose battles here and there. outside of the country. And this ultimately leads to a coup in which he's exiled a second time and he does not make it back the second time. But think about that. Put that into perspective for a minute, okay? Let's say our man, and I know we got some Trump fans in here. Let's say when Trump was leaving office and he was getting on that airplane and he was like, bye, guys. You know, let's say the plane took him to the Middle East and landed and said, here's your house. You're not ever allowed to leave the property. If you ever go back to the United States, they're going to arrest you for treason. And you're going to get the death penalty. And then imagine Donald Trump going into this house, spending a year drawing up plans to take his government back, and then talking his way onto an airplane, flying back to the United States, getting off the airplane, coming, down the tarmac or whatever, and the U.S. Army, sees him, or police officers or whatever, and they're like, hey, you're not even supposed to be here. And then imagine Trump convincing every single person that came to arrest him, we're taking our country back. That's what Napoleon did. He convinced the locals, the law enforcement, things like this, the local militias, we're taking our country back. And then imagine our man Biden sending the FBI saying, go get this dude, arrest him, whatever you got to do. And so the FBI goes, and they never come back because they have also joined the movement. And imagine Trump with a huge army at his back getting to the front lawn of the White House and seeing Biden run. That is what Napoleon accomplished back in his day. And that is why almost every single top list of generals, top 5, top 10, top 100, whatever, that's why most historians are going to agree that Napoleon was number 1. I've seen some make the argument that Julius Caesar was number 1. Caesar was good. I mean, he was really good, but he had a huge army, and he really didn't have to unexile himself. Plus, he had the strength of Cleopatra. Cleopatra and Caesar had kind of a thing going on, and she had a huge army too, so she would often bail him out. It was kind of a mutual assistance thing. So that's it. That's my list. Cornwallis, Yamamoto, Caesar, Robert E. Lee, and Napoleon. And look, I know the hate mail's coming on Robert E. Lee especially. Maybe Cornwallis, because they both lost the biggest war of their career, right? The biggest conflict. Cornwallis had tons of conflicts and, battles and things. But his biggest by far was the Revolutionary War, and he lost. And yet I still put him on the list because of his entire body of work as a general, not just the Revolutionary War. Same with Robert E. Lee. Yeah, he lost the war. But again, he should have lost it 3 months into the war. Based on, if you look at it on paper, that dude didn't have a chance. And yet there were a couple of times when the Union almost fell. There were a couple of times when the Confederates got way up north into Union territory and caused a lot of damage. That never should have happened from a battlefield standpoint. But he was able to pull it off because he was a tremendous general. And that, combined with the success of the Mexican-American War, to me, is enough to put him on this list. So anyway, folks, I am very interested in seeing what you guys have to say. What is on your top 5 list? I know there are a lot of names missing, okay? Can't put everybody on here. I was tempted to honorable mention George Patton. I was even going to throw him there at number 5 for a while. I was tossing it up. George Patton versus Cornwallis. I was thinking about it hard. You've got Rommel, the Desert Fox from World War II, who was just a masterful general when it came to tank warfare. He was really hard to beat. But throughout his entire body of work, Cornwallis accomplished a lot more, in my opinion. Same goes with Patton. Patton did a whole lot as a general, but in the later stages of World War II, he was reduced to... Did you guys know there was a dummy division during World War II. Did you guys know that right before D-Day, Hitler knew the Allies were coming. He just didn't know exactly where they were coming. Did you guys know that the Allies actually set up a dummy division, and they had inflatable like tanks and planes and stuff like that, and they set up tents and everything, and they used reserve troops to move back and forth in order to make the Germans believe they were going to hit a certain beach, and then they hit Normandy instead. But at this point, Patton had been reduced to leading the dummy division, and that had to be a hard pill to swallow for him, because he was a die-hard dude when it came to warfare. So anyway, I'm going to quit rambling now. That is my list. Want to see your lists. And also, let me mention this. All right. I'm thinking about in the next week or two putting these, instead of putting them at like 7 o'clock, maybe putting them on at 6 o'clock, and then directly after doing a live stream over here on the history deal that we got going on, just so I can get some live feedback. I've been thinking about doing that just so we can have a discussion right after the premiere. And it's, guys, not a money thing. I'm not even monetized over here. I would be streaming free of charge. I love to talk history. So if that's something you're interested in, let me know. I'm a level with you. When I set up the backup channel and I decided to go with history, I said, man, we'd be lucky if we get 500 people over here. Nobody cares about history. But I have been overwhelmed in a good way, because so many people seem to care about history. I think, I'll get on my soapbox for a minute here, son. I think that there's so much bad history being taught in our schools right now that people that are remotely interested in real history have taken to the channel. And I'm not going to get everything right on this history channel, okay? The thing with historians is we specialize in one thing. I can tell you almost anything you want to know about World War II. But when you get down to like ancient Rome, I know the basics. And after that, it's a little sketchy. So I don't pretend to know it all. I don't know everything there is to know about Vietnam. I knew enough to get through it, in Korea and things like this. But yeah, I mean, I would just love to do the live stream thing. I would love to hear from you guys during the live stream on the chat and stuff, because I know a lot of you that are here read history and study history. Some of you are probably experts at the Civil War, or Vietnam. I'm not an expert on either of those. And so I would love to hear some of the stories. Maybe you guys can share down below some of your favorite books to read on the different wars, and maybe their documentaries or things like that. But anyway, this is John with Prepper Nation History. Thank you for being here. If you were here for the premiere, thank you very much. Hopefully I'm in here chatting with you. But anyway, until next time, I don't know what we're doing next week. I would love to hear from you guys. Maybe you have some ideas, some things you want to talk about, historical things. Historical things, okay? We're not talking about Joe Biden on this channel all that much. Okay, until next time, take care and God bless.